We're going to move into our keynote lunch session with His Excellency Shaikh Nawaf Al-Sabah, the CEO of KUFPEC, and we're delighted to have him with us from Kuwait today. Introducing him will be Ambassador Deborah Jones, who does not need an introduction.
Well, may I say what an honor and a privilege and a pleasure it is for me to introduce someone who also needs no introduction here today, Shaikh Nawaf Al-Sabah, who I have now known, I guess, for about a decade. I think, when we both looked a little bit differently. But anyway, I just wanted to say in general, and I'm going to make this very short so we have more time for his remarks and for questions, that he represents to me the very best of Kuwait. Kuwait, which is a small country full of surprises and very nice surprises. For those of us who served there as ambassadors, we were privileged to enter into a society that was both very intimate and very active politically and in other ways that were a surprise. And I used to tell members of my staff that if you really wanted to know Kuwait, you had to go on the inside, because they'd say, oh, the landscape is pretty bland. And I'd say, no, the landscapes are on the inside of the people and of their houses, and they were actually so interested in things, in collecting and in discussing, and the Diwania, the family circles that you met and became part of there were legendary for those of us who were privileged to serve there. But I also wanted to say that Kuwait has often been kind of, I don't want to say ignored, taken for granted, and we were just talking about this, by a lot of American policymakers, because it just kind of chugs along in its very Kuwaiti way. And we always used to talk among ourselves that it's kind of the bourgeois country of the Gulf. They're quite frugal, they're quite practical, they move at a pace that is sometimes frustrating to many people, but it's a pace that works for them, and it works for them with a lot of interaction internally and in a way that seems to be quite stable and going at least in the right direction. But I also wanted to say in a very brief thing that even within Kuwait, you do find, as Thomas Jefferson described to John Adams in a letter, this natural aristocracy, that apart from being born into a family that obviously has the responsibility for ruling the country in a very consensual way, you also have this line within the family, who I always considered, according to Thomas Jefferson's definition, the natural aristocracy, who are in the positions they hold by virtue of their virtue and their talent. And I think Shaikh Nawaf fits that bill. So I'm going to welcome you up here, and I will sit to the side and wait to take questions. Thank you.
It's great to see everybody here, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to start off with something that is not, according to the title of this conference, petro diplomacy. Having grown up in Washington, been very much around the diplomatic side of the world, now in the petroleum side, I'm going to posit that there's quite a bit of difference right now between where we are as an industry and politically, and where we were previously. So I would say that in an American setting, if you look at the Rolling Stones song, Sympathy for the Devil, if people remember the lyrics to that, you'll remember that it infused Lucifer into almost every world event around from the beginning of time all the way to the 1960s, which is when apparently the song was written. I'm going to posit that if Mick Jagger and his cohorts were to write that song now and it restricted only to the last 100 years, it might be called Sympathy for the Barrel. Because most world events around from the past 100 years, whether you're talking about Rockefeller, the Standard Oil Trust, moving on to the World War II, when oil was a central part of the policy making and the war fighting, and you're talking about the embargo on oil to Japan, which ultimately led to them bombing Pearl Harbor, or you're talking about Hitler's push towards the Middle East. It was to try to seize the oil fields. You move on into the 60s, 70s, ultimately the nationalizations that happened in the 1970s in our region, the Iran-Iraq War, and the internationalization of the Gulf through the Carter Doctrine, the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine, up until the 1990s when you had Iraq's territorial ambitions, Iran as well. All of that was very closely allied with oil and how things moved. What prompted these world events and how the markets reacted to those world events was quite stark. Now, the problem with that is, at the beginning of this decade, you had an Arab Spring. You had civil wars in Yemen, in Syria, around countries around the Gulf. You had ISIS take over 1/3 of Iraq, the northern oil-producing region of Iraq. Libya go offline. All of that happened, and the price of oil plummeted. Obviously, there was a disconnect and a difference between the trajectory of oil prices and world events, especially in the region. What was causing that? I would say there are two possible explanations. The first one would be that there was an exogenous shift of the demand curve for oil, that a substitution effect came in. When oil prices went up so high, consumers switched to different types of cars. If you take a look at statistics, the number of miles driven during that entire time was pretty much the same, but demand fell. So people shifted their purchases of vehicles into better fuel efficiency vehicles. But the problem with that is that over time, you found that the lower oil prices stimulated demand. The world economy is now having recovered. Oil demand has shot up over 100 million barrels of oil a day for the first time in history. So perhaps that's not the best explanation of the difference here. Now, you'll ask me perhaps about price projections, and I'd say price projections always depend on, and I see our BP friends smiling, but the price projections are always going to be dependent upon the price elasticity of demand. Nobody knows what that is right now, so we won't project prices. So I'd say the second reason that you see this disconnect between the politics and the oil is that in the post-2014 flooded oil market, the price of oil was set by, more or less for a few years, by the cost of the marginal barrel of U.S. shale production. And with the advent of, and development of technology that reduced the price of producing a shale barrel, tight oil, in the United States, you saw a race to the bottom between oil prices and, on the other side, the cost of that barrel production. They plummeted both towards the bottom, and then what happened was, with drilling and completion costs having gone down about 40%, and what happened here was EUR's ultimate recoveries from each well increased, and producers were able to deploy that technology to create more, extract more hydrocarbons from each well that they drilled. But as U.S. tight oil production hit new highs, we now see pipeline constraints coming out of West Texas, limiting the amount of Permian oil that comes to market. So here, the cost, the element of the price being driven by the cost of the barrel of U.S. tight oil comes into play, because there is no more additional, significant amounts of additional U.S. Production coming to market. A lot of it tends to be stranded in West Texas until the pipeline issues are resolved. So this leaves an opening. Where's the market going? And here's where we think conventional oil must continue to play that role. With, again, here's a problem. Decline rates are about 5% of oil. So if you're talking about 100 million barrel a day market, take away a significant portion of that for various reasons, and won't be in decline. If you apply that number to the remaining segment, you'll end up with a requirement to replace the production of a country the size of the state of Kuwait every year for the next number of years. And that is significant. So but here the problem is that IOCs, international oil companies, during the downturn, took off about $1 trillion of capital expenditures, development expenditures during that period. And the typical cycle is that once you discover oil, it takes about 7 to 8 years to bring that oil to production and ultimately to market. With oil, with discoveries down to about a third of what they normally were pre-2014 price collapse, you now have a gap of oil that is not going to come to market 7 years from that time, around 2022 or so. So come 2022, the world will be looking for additional supplies, and typically that would come from discoveries that would have been made in 2014, 15, 16. And those didn't happen. And we're starting to see some of those effects right now. Now, what do we do about it, though? As a national oil company in Kuwait, the company I represent, KUFPEC, is part of, as you all know, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, the state-owned oil company. KPC has always viewed its role as essential to adding stability to the markets, making sure that supplies are available as demand increases. So what are we doing? Well, ever since oil was discovered in Kuwait in 1938, we've taken that responsibility seriously. And we are planning to spend $400 billion over the next couple of decades to increase our production and refining capabilities worldwide as part of Kuwait's commitment to be a responsible and stable supplier of oil and hydrocarbons to the world. We're going to do that by increasing our domestic production by 50%, from 3 million higher. We're going to do that as well by building a new refinery that is being built right now at 650,000 barrels of oil a day. That will be in addition to the international refineries that we are building in various places, strategic places around the world. And then also, the company I represent, KUFPEC, the foreign exploration production arm of KPC, we're planning to increase our production to about 150,000 barrels of oil a day by 2020, maintain that for the next 20 years. Why do we do that? It's 150,000 barrels of oil a day is part of Kuwait's production of 3 million or more barrels, is a drop in the proverbial barrel, if you will, of the world supply. But what we do is as KUFPEC, we exist because we bring in technology and know-how that KOC, our sister company, the domestic production arm, does not have. Most of our production, for example, is offshore, as at KUFPEC. Kuwait has not yet developed its offshore capabilities. All of our production has been onshore for the past 80 years. So now as we start to look to offshore production, we will drill our first offshore well in Kuwaiti waters next year. KUFPEC will be there with KOC to help guide how we operate that well. Similarly, in shale, we've never produced a molecule of shale hydrocarbons in Kuwait, but we have tremendous shale resources that we've just kept drilling through to get to the conventional reservoirs. So KUFPEC is now in a partnership with Chevron in the Duvernay shale gas and condensate play in Alberta, Canada. There we are learning development of of shale gas and condensate, and our contract and our agreement with Chevron allows us to put people into that project all the way through the system, so that we can bring in bright young engineers from Kuwait, put them in as operators in Alberta, and be able to transfer that knowledge back to Kuwait when we ultimately do decide to develop the shale resources in Kuwait. Same thing for heavy oil. Part of the strategy for KPC to reach 4.5 million barrels a day from the current 3 is development of heavy oil. It's costly, it's intensive in terms of electricity demand, but what we're trying to do as well in KUFPEC is to get involved in heavy oil production facilities around the world so that we can, and again, bring that type of knowledge and reservoir practices to Kuwait. And then finally, for KUFPEC, we are working to supply Kuwait with LNG. Kuwait is oil rich and right now gas poor. We have non-associated gas fields that are quite promising, but they require a bit of some time to develop, and with electricity demand increasing exponentially in Kuwait, we are importing LNG. So now we are partners in the Wheatstone LNG facility in Western Australia, where we are producing gas that we discovered as KUFPEC. Now we're producing it, liquefying it, and selling it as LNG, with the ability to take those molecules to Kuwait once we need them. Now, it doesn't make sense physically to take molecules all the way from Australia to Kuwait because of boil-off and various other transportation issues that might occur. But it at least gives us the ability to have a strategic amount of LNG that we can use for swap opportunities and other opportunities going along. So what are the headwinds to KPC's policy here then? What do we see as potential headwinds? Well, first, domestically, it's just project execution. Can we execute on our projects efficiently, on time? And here we're starting to see a return to cost creep with contractors. Costs are starting to creep up. Contractor availability is becoming more of an issue. A lot of contractors laid off a lot of people during the downturn, and they don't have the ability to deploy people around the world that they used to. And also, we want to maintain our autonomous decision-making that KPC's always done well with. The other one is really security of demand. If we're spending $400 billion to develop production facilities, we want to make sure that there's going to be someone out there to buy them. And here I'm reminded of the statement that everybody keeps using, is that the Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stones. Well, the hydrocarbon age will end, and there will be still plenty of hydrocarbons in the ground. So there's no question that there will be some hydrocarbon assets stranded around the world, and some of these will remain there for cost reasons, environmental impact reasons, accessibility, and others. But I'd posit that the internal combustion engine is really going to continue to drive demand going into the future. Today's electric vehicles, for example, make up about 1% of vehicle auto sales. In fact, the fact I like the most is that more Ford F-150 trucks were sold in the state of Texas than electric vehicles worldwide over the last year. So, but we think that by 2030, you'll see an increase from about 1% of the auto fleet to about 10%. That's significant. But again, that's only 10%. And then by 2040, you'll see the inflection point potentially, and because of various technological issues people expect, vehicles will become more prevalent, and they'll probably get to about a third of auto sales. That's still a lot of auto sales for the internal combustion engine, which will, of course, also become much better in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of the CAFE standards the fuel efficiency standards that will be implemented. So what does this mean for oil demand? Again, I'm not going to talk about the prices. I'll talk perhaps about what we see as demand. And I would say here that we've already surpassed 100 million barrels of oil a day in terms of demand, but we'll need another 10 million barrels of incremental, there's 10 million barrels, I think, of incremental demand, and that will have to be supplied somewhere in the world. Kuwait is going to increase its production capacity by 1.5 million barrels. Saudi Arabia, from what I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, that's a couple million extra. The UAE will, same types of numbers. All of those I'm still counting on one hand. We're not yet at 10. And that is a tremendous amount of effort that's going to be required between now and the next decade to get those resources to market. On the US tight oil side, people kept saying they like to call them, I think the Economist once called it the sheikhs versus shale. It's not. It never was. It is, we recognize that US tight oil was probably going to take up most of the demand increases during the next couple of years. But you're already seeing the pipeline constraints, and that's why you have prices where they are right now, because supply has balanced out with demand, and there's no additional supply coming out, significant supply coming out of Texas. But those things will be sorted out. The Economist, if I was talking about the Economist, if you remember, they've alternated between calling the age of oil dead and then insisting that the world is awash in oil about a year later. And then most recently, I like their cover picture, which calls the internal combustion engine roadkill. We don't see that. It is the news of the internal combustion engine's death is greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain would have said. So, what's the future for the industry? What does this really mean for us? The real challenge for us now is how will the oil industry create a less carbon-intensive atmosphere? And the key, we think, is carbon capture, sequestration, storage. We're working on the technology to capture the carbon emissions at the sources. And here we're talking about factories. We're talking about refineries and other plants. Very little CO2 as a percentage of worldwide CO2 emissions comes from the tailpipe of the internal combustion engine. Most of it comes from factories, stable places where you can actually capture that carbon. Then the question is, what do you do with it? You can either inject it, and as I was saying, conventional oil is going into a new phase of development that requires enhanced oil recovery techniques. You would typically find that EOR techniques would rely on water or gas to stimulate the additional production. And the problem now is that water is more expensive, more scarce, more valuable than it ever was, and will continue to be more valuable, increase in its value. And the same thing for gas. Until a few years ago, gas was a byproduct and would be flared. Now it's being used worldwide. So if we can instead replace that with CO2 injection to help lift oil production, that would take care of two issues at once. The technology is not completely there yet. We've been working on it. Most people say right now, if you were to do that with CO2 injection, it's not as good as the other sources, but it adds, and it also adds about $20 per barrel, $15 to $20 per barrel in terms of production costs. That's too expensive right now, but I'm sure the technology will develop over time. That should be mankind's next moonshot, which is how to take out CO2 from this industry and use it for other purposes. So I'd close by saying that it's vital for us to maintain oil really as a commodity and not as a political tool. For those of us in the oil-producing countries of the Gulf, that we recognize that we are really indispensable to this equation. The last barrel of oil produced on Earth will come from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. So our strengths really lie in our abilities to project power through petrodiplomacy, but instead, not so much that, but instead to our power really lies in our common ancestry and our shared visions for the future. So with that, I'll take as many questions as you like. Thank you.
So, first question, and these three look like the same handwriting, so I'm waiting to hear from others out there. How are you doing with your neighbor Iraq and the shared oil fields? What about future cooperation with Iraq or not?
Well, to be frank, we've struggled over the years with those fields. Ever since the liberation of Iraq, we had intentions to import gas from Iraq. We had an intentions also to develop we had two fields that straddle the border, and those are that development is vital to both sides. We have reached agreement with them now to unitize the fields so that we can better produce out of those and recognize each side's interests and ownership of those fields.
You commented on the upstream investment shortage since 2014. Does Kuwait, whether KPC or KUFPEC, worry about escalating price volatility in the future, and what to do about that risk?
I think price volatility is going to be the name of the game for the next number of years because of the inconsistency of the supplies coming onto market. We would not see prices where they are right now if enough oil was coming out of the Permian onto market. What the OPEC Plus agreement did was essentially to stabilize the supply and demand balance. And we always anticipated that additional supplies would be coming along, and they'll probably eat up the demand capture, let's say, not the demand that would be coming over the next few years. That's not happening with that. So you're going to see volatility. We see it, we recognize it, but we are long on oil. Our difference is right now, we're seeing international oil companies, our partners, our friends, prioritizing investments that are short cycle, investments that have to pay back within a certain short number of years, or else they won't do it. They won't do projects that go on and require many, many years of production until they break even. But we're doing essentially that. That's what differentiates us as NOCs from the international oil companies, because we are long on oil, and we will take the volatility over time. We're working as countries in the region to restructure our economies to make them less reliant upon the fluctuations in oil prices. I recognize that Kuwait has probably more to do than to catch up than other countries in the region, but it is a recognition that we have to mitigate the effects of the price volatility, but that will not impact our ability, our desire to make those investments.
Okay. And this one you knew was coming, and I can already guess your answer. Can you discuss the status of the neutral zone negotiations with Saudi Arabia?
That's an easy one. That is far above my pay grade, so I don't know anything.
I could have guessed that answer. Okay, these are all the questions we've received. No more questions from the audience? Anyone? Susan?
Can I ask you about the status of LNG? You were talking about the shifting of LNG. You're getting LNG from other sources. Could you talk about some of the sources of LNG and what kind of future you're looking at in terms of the development of LNG in Kuwait in terms of associated and non-associated gas?
Sure. Right now, I mentioned our participation in the Wheatstone LNG facility in Western Australia and how much that would bring in terms of LNG to Kuwait and equity LNG that we have available. We have large non-associated gas fields in Kuwait that have not yet been developed. They are high pressure, high temperature. They're quite sour, so there's the sulfur effects that need to be handled. All of that requires a lot of assistance from international companies, and we've signed enhanced technical services agreements with a number of them to help us to develop those fields. But that will take time. So in the meantime, we are importing LNG. We will continue to buy LNG on the market through long-term agreements. But we're also looking at opportunities to make investments in LNG or in projects that would give us equity LNG to take to Kuwait. So we're balancing all of those together until price subsidies of electricity in Kuwait are rationalized. Our electricity demand will soar exponentially, faster than population growth. It's just too easy, it's too cheap in Kuwait that people, as you all know, will travel on summer vacations and not touch the thermostat before they go away. Because it just takes, it's not worth it, the cost difference for most people. We have to change that, I think, and we're, the government has already taken steps, and those are welcome, but we have to rationalize that use.
I remember that battle the first time the government tried to send bills for actual electrical use, and it was a mere percentage, and the Kuwaitis went wild. And because that's kind of the way we see, some of our programs for retirees or et cetera here. It's an interesting one. Okay, this segues into what you were just talking about. In what areas can you see Kuwait working with IOCs? And what can Kuwait do on its own? And I think probably if you could talk a little bit here maybe for people about Kuwait's constitution has some unique limitations, and we've seen some back and forth over the years on this.
Under the Constitution, and here I'm speaking as a lawyer, so I'm more comfortable in that realm. Under the Constitution, the hydrocarbons are owned by the state. For any, and the Constitution actually does allow concession agreements, but they just must be approved by Parliament individually as laws. That's quite complicated. You'd never want 50 Parliament members trying to negotiate a concession agreement with an international company. And that's not something that we wanted to do. We had concession arrangements in the past. We nationalized. We've been able to effectively run our industry in Kuwait on our own. So what we do need, though, is some technical skills. And that's what we've done recently, is reach agreements with Shell and BP and others to bring in their best and brightest people to assist us, to sit next to us as we develop some of the more challenging reserves, and essentially help us as technical services. They don't have rights to oil. They don't have exposure to the oil price. It is, if you will, a type of a consultancy agreement, but it's not. I mean, but it's in that sort of general bucket of types of agreements. But the other side of that is KUFPEC and what we're doing. If some of you may remember that in the 1990s we had a project called the Kuwait Project. It was an idea to bring in international companies to operate the fields. Legally, that was not an issue. Politically, it became an issue. For various reasons, we weren't able to get the enabling law that would have allowed that through Parliament. So instead, what we're doing now as KUFPEC is making the investments that I'd mentioned earlier, and taking the people from Kuwait, instead of bringing companies into Kuwait, Now we're taking our guys from Kuwait, embedding them into those challenging projects around the world, and then bringing them back. And one of them, for example, in Wheatstone and LNG, we took people from our refining sector, young, bright Kuwaiti engineers, put them in a remote area of Western Australia, working with Chevron and Bechtel and the other companies to build and ultimately commission the LNG facility. An LNG liquefaction plant is not that different than a refinery. So they took that knowledge and experience, brought it back to Kuwait. Now we're building a refinery, largest refinery it will be the largest refinery in the region, and they've got that experience that they would not have otherwise had. Our legal system doesn't allow us to have the types of agreements that other countries in the region have with international oil companies.
Okay, and this kind of goes into that as well. Acknowledging the current sensitivities with Qatar, who is a gas giant, could you see Kuwait purchasing LNG not directly from Qatar, but instead from gas aggregators or portfolio sellers like BP, Shell, or others?
We buy gas from the market, and we have reached an agreement with Shell for a large portion of our gas demands, LNG demands for the next 5 years. And we've got other companies as well that aggregators, as you say, where they source their gas, usually is from their portfolio. Interestingly enough, the very first shipment of LNG that came to Kuwait came from Sakhalin in Russia, and the far side of Russia from Kuwait's perspective. That is, but that made sense economically. Qatar, for example, already had its gas already committed to its buyers, so it didn't have the availability. The best availability at that time was from Sakhalin. So we've been aggregating from various sources, and they've normally been the international companies. Again, KUFPEC will play a role coming in the future of bringing a base load of quantity of equity LNG to Kuwait.
I'm going to take the opportunity of being here to ask one more. We saw today it was announced that the UAE had assigned Khaldoon Mubarak as special envoy to China. Could you talk a little bit about Kuwait's energy relationship with China or not?
Sure. I'll start with KUFPEC. We've been in China since the early 1980s. We discovered gas in the South China Sea, and that gas is used to power electricity in Hong Kong and on Hainan Island. We've been a proud partner with CNOOC, the Chinese company, in that development. We also have additional assets in China from the KUFPEC perspective, but the partnership with China is much larger than that. Right now, Sinopec is, if I'm not mistaken, it is the largest international company operating drilling rigs in Kuwait. As part of our plan to increase our production of domestic oil, we need to drill a few thousand wells. The Chinese, through Sinopec, have participated extremely well with excellent health, safety, and environment outcomes. Their safety records have been phenomenally good. China is also one of the largest buyers of Kuwaiti crude, and we were hoping to develop that relationship even further by building a refinery with Sinopec in China. That hasn't happened yet, but we're still hopeful that we can find other ways to develop the relationship with China.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, then I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you to Shaikh Nawaf. Thank you so much for the detailed and technical answers. And